So our next panel is titled Protecting Human Rights, Role of Governments and Businesses, and it will be moderated by Silvio Gonzato, Ambassador and Head of the European Union Delegation to Albania.
The debate on business and human rights has been quite prominent in the multilateral arena. I saw it from New York, but it was very, very present in Geneva. The difference was perhaps in the way in which diplomats wanted to approach it. Some felt that what we needed was international binding instruments. Others, like the European Union, were against that, but were more in favor or recognized the need for appropriate legislation, and Robert referred to it. And others, again, were merely promoting non-binding tools, such as the guiding principles. And the debate is obviously very topical also for the Adria region, as it strives to fill the development gap with the rest of Europe. Unfortunately, human rights, sustainability, and environmental considerations are often not at the top of the political agenda, with government opting for short-termism, quick wins, and piecemeal approaches, thus failing to promote and indeed demand sustainable business practices. So, Dunja, what can one do to enhance the accountability of state institutions, particularly here in the region, for protecting human rights in the context of business activities? How do you see, how can we push them to do more in this direction?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to have the opportunity to talk about issues of such an importance, also at a time, as you rightly stated, I just finalized my mandate as a Commissioner for Human Rights, hoping that I will be on a well-deserved holiday, but then Biljana intervened and I had to listen. And now I also had to listen to a very dear colleague of mine, Robert Spano, who actually raised a very important issue when it comes to business and human rights, and how we see the issues even after so many years, I would say even decades of talking about business and human rights at the UN level, at the EU level, and globally. And where do we stand at the moment? So the challenges, I would say, are great. And when it comes to the region, you posed a very relevant question on what the governments could do more here in the region when it comes to businesses and human rights. But I would sort of turn it around a bit, what the governments in the region, in the Western Balkans and broader, should do in protection of human rights in general. So the challenge is even bigger than just human rights. And I think when it comes to businesses, there are more and more, particularly the ones that are reaching out of the region and reaching out to be partners internationally. They understand that they need to change. They need to change their policies, they need to change their approaches, and they need to adapt to the new realities. And this new reality is genuinely and actively implementing everything that is related to human rights protection. And here it comes also the issue related to diversity, gender equality, and many other things. So it's not just ticking a box and really saying, okay, yes, we will protect human rights when introducing our businesses. They do understand that they cannot be considered as serious partners internationally if they do not do more. And we were here also touching upon the issue of the responsibility of the governments, but at the same time also responsibility of the companies. But I would add here also the responsibility of media, of civil society, and the society as a whole. So I would stop here and then I'll join later on some other thoughts on this.
Yes, I can see your reflexes as former Commissioner for Media Freedom, that the media aspect needs to be brought in very, very pertinently. Yes. But Andrea, perhaps you could say from your perspective, from your experience, is there a particular way or a sort of good practice for establishing a roadmap that would lead to a true partnership between business and governments when it comes to respect for human rights and advancement of human rights. And we mean human rights in a very broad sense, covering also social responsibility, environmental responsibility, etc. What's your view there?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's my first time in Montenegro, and I'm super enjoying it. I love it. Let me say two foundational things, which is the business and human rights landscape has been defined at the UN level, right? And that was in 2011 when the Human Rights Council unanimously endorsed something called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And that established not only the state duty to protect human rights in the context of commercial activities, but then the company responsibility to respect. In a sense, it defined very differentiated roles for companies and business. And what is interesting about a couple of important shifts that the UN Guiding Principles put into play? The first shift is that, human rights is always a difficult discussion with governments. But you can talk about business and human rights with governments in a much more constructive way. It's so true that the UN Development Program, that always stayed very far away from human rights discussion, has now adopted a huge program on business and human rights. And the Global Business Initiative, as I said, we're 23 multinationals working together on human rights standards. We held a business and human rights discussion in China. And we were the first to have a human rights official discussion in China, but it was a business and human rights discussion in China. And why I'm saying that is that the discussion with states on business and human rights is really about how do you make your market serve your needs, right? How can you use your legislative powers, your policy space, to make sure that commercial activities are serving the needs of the people. And so governments have opened the doors to those discussions. On the company side, the responsibility to respect sets out what you're supposed to do. And the UN Guiding Principles have been designed to incentivize what we call collective action in this space. Collective action means calling in all kinds of stakeholders, including the state. So if you talk with company, even the boards and CEOs, what they will say to you and what the companies in the Global Business Initiative say is every human rights challenge, we look at our impacts and we've got challenges, whether I can name a couple. Let's say a mining company has around their mining site child prostitution. They didn't create that situation. There's a root cause, but they are incentivized through the guiding principles to call into play local governments, regional governments, the national government, international organizations. And so what companies have been doing since 2011 with the UN guiding principles is they have been learning how to have those different kinds of conversations. We have a challenge here. How can we call you in on this challenge? The partnerships, creating partnerships with governments is difficult because the government is not one person, that you have to find the right part of government that's incentivized to work with you. But those are all skills that companies are more and more building. And the heads of sustainability or the heads of human rights are building those skills to be able to call in the public sector to get at the root causes of human rights issues.
I was quite intrigued with what you said about your meeting in China, because I think probably the kind of discussion you had with them was a much more, let's say, open and fruitful one than the formal human rights dialogue that, for example, the EU has with China, which is very, as I said, very formalized. So it's an interesting way of approaching human rights issues also in a difficult context like that of China. But I wanted to move to Luke, and we heard from Robert the approach taken by the EU. First, transparency in the realization that it's no longer a vertical relationship when it comes to, or at least not just vertical, but it's also an horizontal one, and that corporate business have their responsibility. So they started with transparency, and now we are at the due diligence level, which has also opportunities for individuals to seek reparation for damages, etc. So it's becoming heavy, let's say, seen from the viewpoint of business. What's your feeling in your daily contacts with business people? Is this type of legislation motivating executives to understand better the context in which they operate today, or does it provide sometimes disincentives? We were talking about it with Andrea the day before. It can be a disincentive from investing, for example, in a context which, from a political viewpoint, from a human rights viewpoint, can be risky.
Well, maybe where I should start, and first of all, thank you for the invitation, and very nice to be here. And it's always great when you get to a new country and you start to learn about it and see the culture and learn about what makes it tick, which is one of the most enjoyable things I get to do in my job, actually, is to travel around and to learn about people and learn about what their issues and concerns are, often in the context of business operations. So I think I want to start with just kind of perhaps trying to simplify, what is the C in this case, because it was approved yesterday, so it's a hot topic, the CSDDD of the EU really asking for from businesses. One of the simplest ways I find to think about it is that it's asking businesses to put in place a management process, right, which we call human rights due diligence, which is the way the UNGP said businesses should implement the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And that process is about identifying, prioritizing, assessing, prioritizing, addressing, remediating, reporting, tracking, and reporting on impacts. But I would say it has, and it is in many ways, for businesses, easiest to think about that as something which is akin to perhaps a quality management process, health and safety management process. But it has some particular features. And I would say the features are that, one, it requires that you involve stakeholders. And by stakeholders, we don't particularly just mean the traditional stakeholders that we often think about in a CSR conversation, the investors, the powerful people, the governments in the system. But we're also thinking about perhaps more vulnerable people in our own operations or our supply chains. They could be the migrant workers. They could be the ladies who run the laundries for the hotels, that we see down this street. So some of really taking care to make sure you understand the totality of the range of people who you impact through your business activities, and you're thinking about how to engage them and listen to them and hear what their issue, what the impacts of their lives are of your business activities. And I think the first one is that you need to do that engagement. I think the second one, speaks to how you relate what you hear and learn to standards, particularly international standards, as well as perhaps local legislation, but using international human rights standards as a benchmark. And the third one is about how you prioritize, essentially. Now, there's more, but I think these are the three main basic. And that you prioritize, traditionally we would prioritize in business, wouldn't we, on the case of, how's it going to impact our income? How's it going to affect our business activity? We're being asked now to shift to a model, and I think it's completely aligned with what Robert was saying, where we're looking at risk to people, risk to the people, risk to the environments in which we're operating. And we're using that as a lens to help us prioritize where we choose to focus our effort as a business and where we proactively take steps. And I think, this is the process that most businesses need to work through, and it does take some time. And I think actually it's not a bad thing that there's more time to comply now with the EU legislation, because it gives businesses more time to do this properly. But it gives them their agenda for how do we go out then and engage with governmental actors and other actors to seek to resolve some of the problems we can't resolve on our own. So, good examples of this might be some of the companies I work with, say in Zimbabwe, who, we have problems of child labour, with problems of deforestation. Now we have that priority set, we can work with other companies, we can work start to work with who in the government we have to work with, look at who in the international sphere do we need to work with to bring bearing on some of these, long-term and intractable issues haven't been able to sort. So that's probably as long as I should talk for now.
No, thank you. Actually, it sounds like a very complex task. In fact, one that requires requires skills that not necessarily corporate business has at the moment. So it's really a transformational process that they have to go through. But it also emphasizes, both of you were referring to the fact that corporate business work in a context with different stakeholders, and therefore what Dunja was saying at the beginning, that is not just a question for business or government, but there's a variety of actors that need to be implicated. Nevena, coming to you, I was wondering if you could say something about what are the accompanying measures that would be necessary to address, for example, here in the region. Obviously, the fact that the EU is adopting legislation in this area, and the fact that this region, and it should be reminded, is part of the integration process that Federica Mogherini was referring to, and there is clearly now a momentum, particularly here in Montenegro, in that respect. But legislation, okay, it's an obligation, but could be turned into a tick-in-the-box exercise. But there must be accompanying measures that are necessary in order to help governments, business, to comply with these new requirements and address issues like informal economy, precarious working conditions, and the lack of reporting for lack of willingness or perhaps lack of competence to do so.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on this panel and maybe bring in a bit of a regional perspective on this. So our region is not, it has its own specifics, and companies operate in a certain context that is a bit different than in other parts of the world. And it might be a good way to explain it, that it is a bit polarized between companies who are operating in a great manner, following all the international standards, companies who are on the way to fulfill that, and companies who are completely still ignoring the fact that this process is happening right next door in the EU. And that is causing a bit of a confusion on the market and imposing kind of different levels of stress on different companies. And in this context, for example, the issues that you mentioned, like informal work, precarious work, should be mostly in the hands of the governments to resolve. But I think that in the market, like Western Balkans, there is plenty for companies to do in that sense. It's very hard to measure the size of informal work, but it should be, the data is saying that is around 1/5 people who are working in the region are actually involved in some form of informal work. And predominantly in some sectors, these are women, which kind of adds up to the discussion that we had on a previous panel. So by acknowledging that at first, companies are doing great, kind of starting on a good note. Minimum wage, for example, let me just give you one example. So minimum wage is assigned by the law, and by most of the regional laws should be exception that companies imposes to the workers in the cases where it has to, due to the operational difficulties that they are going through. That is by labor law. But in practice, minimum wage is a standard that is covering, for example, in Serbia, 500,000 of the workers, 2,500,000 people works by the minimum wage. Just by acknowledging that minimum wage is not enough and not even close to a living wage, companies are putting the bar much higher and kind of pushing the leveling playing field up and pushing up the bottom line. So that might be a good example, just not accommodating the fact that minimum wage is well accepted in the society and considered to be a wage that you go and work for. They are already doing much for the sectors and the problems that should be mostly in the government's scope. Yeah.
So sometimes it can be business pushing the agenda even more than governments. Coming back to you, Luke, I was thinking, can we look at the whole issue from the perspective also of business? Is there an incentive for business to do more? Is there an economic dividend, so to speak, that would incentivize business to take on this responsibility that, in a way, is new for them?
I mean, I think there's a practical reality which I find with most of the businesses, if not all the businesses that we're working with or talking to in supply chains, and that is first and foremost that this is increasingly part of customer investor requirements. So even before the legislation, they're being asked by, be it the big brand customer, or be it by the consumer, actually, and maybe the consumer doesn't say it clearly and articulately, but there's definitely you know, and I think we can probably all know about that. There's a trend and a demand towards seeing the provenance of our food, where our clothes are manufactured, and things like that, in good conditions. So I think that's the first drive. So, you know, get your processes right, you position yourself well to win new business, expand your existing businesses, or stay in supply chains. That's the honest reality. I think, you know, the legislation then brings that in often outside of the EU. What I'm finding is that it is the forced labour, the deforestation legislations, those legislations, the US and the EU, which are seeking to stop products associated with those evils at the border, are the ones that are really making businesses sit up and take note, because they want to be able to continue to sell to as wide a market as they can. And so that's where I'm seeing that companies, you know, perhaps on the edge of the EU, perhaps in Turkey, are taking the most notice right now. And those, of course, require them to develop due diligence processes which enable them to demonstrate to the border officials that their products are not being made involved with forced labour or deforestation. You know, I would say that's the same thing. I mean, I'm a great believer, frankly, that, you know, most of us, if not all of us, want to run good businesses and basically, you know, good people. I might, one or two people in this world that I might not entirely apply that to. And I would, but essentially I believe people want to run, you know, do good things for other people. And so I think, you know, there's many people who just want, you know, they welcome the processes for doing the right thing as a business. And the third thing I say is, look, you know, we're in a changing world. Robert talked about technology. He talked about climate change. He talked about what you could, you know, increasing inequalities that bring increasing instability. We are, I think, entering a phase of, and it's almost a truism, I know, because, you know, if you look back over 50 years, what, you know, we've seen tremendous changes over that time, but even so in the next 10, 15, 20 years, you know, the sort of level of societal upheaval and change, you know, is going to be phenomenal. Businesses who develop good human rights due diligence processes and practices are the ones who understand best their operating environments and understand how they need to adapt, how they can support those environments they operate in to be resilient, where they source from. So it's like, it's strategic intelligence. And so, you know, I think there's some very strong drivers for businesses to adopt these practices and implement them well and thoroughly, in a sense. And now, as well, increasingly they are required to do so.
Incidentally, I didn't say, but if other panelists want to intervene on the same thing, please just Yes, please. Yeah, because we want to make it a bit interactive.
Because I agree with you, Luke, and I mean, we've known each other a long time. I think we have the same
Just as
thoughts
well you
about-
agree with me, Andrea.
I'm going to disagree with you.
Might be more exciting if you didn't.
But I think there's a risk because, of course, good companies are going to understand the strategic importance of it, and they're going. But there will always be the laggards, and there will always be a lot of them, and a lot of companies that are completely tuned out. And right, so the legislation brings them up, but there's a tension there because the leaders, you know, where you have a robust sustainability human rights department, you're putting into place human rights due diligence and all of the things that the law is not asking you to do, right? Now, I can say from the companies in GBI, they're saying, we're going for international standards. The legislation is coming in here. What happens to the gap? How do I continue to incentivize my board, my CEO, to not make the floor the ceiling, right? And there is a tension there. And I can tell you that companies are very worried. The people inside the companies that are asking for more budget, that are trying to do really good work, you know, they're worried that legislation will actually take the wind out of their sails. So I think we have to see. You're bringing up the laggards, but there's a risk also with legislation for the leaders.
But since you outlined this risk, what could be the answer to that? Because I mean, legislation in a way is a trigger. Is the only way sometimes to set in motion a process. So I think from the EU viewpoint, I think it was inevitable. We had to get there. But how can that be just, as you say, just the floor and not, you know, the minimum standard, and not, is that, you know, the increasing awareness of consumers? I think consumers are becoming more and more demanding, or what else? What other pressure could be brought to bear?
Well, I work with a lot of companies that have nothing to do with a consumer name. You would have never heard of them. They're B2B companies. And so the consumer piece, and even the investor piece, let's be honest, investors have a long way to go. They are not asking about human rights. They are not knowledgeable about human rights, not as much as they need to be. So what we're talking to companies, when I talk with boards or CEOs, what I say is, don't look at the CSDDD. You need to look at deforestation. You look at all of the suite of things happening in Europe, but look across the world. We're tracking 68 countries that have human rights and business legislation either on the table or passed. The trajectory is like this. So we say, look at the trajectory, and how do you get future ready? You get future ready by looking at international standards that are the model for all of that legislation. All of that legislation, if you look at the legislative history, it's all based on the international standards, OECD guidelines and UN. So we say, don't focus on what's legislation today, get future ready, because this stuff is really hard and complicated. So that's what we say to the leaders.
So coming to you, Dunja, since you said indeed that one should look at the international standards, and that often legislation takes a step-by-step approach, and so doesn't go for the full Monty, so to speak, but takes this more gradual approach. What is the role of international monitoring mechanisms that are in place? Could they exercise a role here in incentivizing business to take a more long-term approach to these issues? Normally monitoring mechanisms of international organizations look more at the responsibility of governments, don't they? Should we change that, perhaps?
International organizations, I would say, but there are monitoring mechanisms and tools looking at the businesses, which is a different basket of the responsibility. But if I may, say something that is really not a direct answer to your question, I will try to reply to this. But I was listening to all three of you being real experts on these issues, and I'm definitely not an expert when it comes to businesses as such. but human rights, yes, I am. And I have, based on my experience and everything I did in my life, I have this very sort of, firm view on the importance of human rights in anything in our life, which I know most of us here share. But at the same time, I always thought when it comes to businesses that there is a huge potential in introducing human rights to the society, not to mention the governments. And I never had a chance to explore this myself as a commissioner for human rights or a person working on the hardcore human rights issues. And I thought that maybe it's a bit of philosophical, but also idealistic sort of approach, that if we can fix human rights and if we can introduce and sell human rights to governments via businesses, we are almost reaching a possibility to sort of say, yes, we are getting there. And the reason for this is really treating people equally, introducing diversity, payment, how we deal with migrants, how we treat LGBTI community, how we deal with women, do we use children as labor? So whatever you touch, you come to human rights issues. But when you talk to the governments and when you talk to the businesses, the moment you mention human rights, and this is in this contemporary time that we live in, it's like sort of, everybody's allergic to human rights. We don't need human rights, not to mention the conservative view on everything to do with multilateralism and all the issues that we are constantly facing. So my question, in a way, is also, can we do more in order really to show the importance of businesses not only introducing human rights agenda, but also showing that this is a way towards a more sustainable future, that will show that introducing human rights issues, you mentioned legislation, it's important, but sometimes this is coming to the ticking, of the box and not really implementing. And then we have transparency, accountability, and possibility to sort of, seek justice in certain cases. And this is something that I had to deal with in my work as a commissioner. So it is really related more into sort of trying to see a broader picture or looking forward in order to see how we can achieve more with the help of businesses, and how businesses then can influence also the governments that are not listening and they do not want to listen on the importance of human rights implementation. But maybe I'm reaching too far in my sort of wishful thinking agenda now after 6 years as a commissioner.
No, actually, I think you raised an important point, and it's interesting that you change the perspective. Not governments telling business what to do, but businesses incentivizing governments to do more. But that made me think about an issue that we have as EU. Often our investments come with a lot of strings attached, environmental impact assessment, social impact assessment, blah, 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 transparency, good governance, and then there's other countries that come with quick money, but necessarily not with investments which are very sustainable and not investments that create long-term prosperity for the country in question. How do we increase the competitive advantage, let's say, of our offer in the eyes of governments? Often they are in the hands of, they are in the hands of politicians that are just looking for the quick win. They're just looking for a quick, visibility and not necessarily for the long-term good of their country. Who wants to step in? Nevena?
Just a short...
and then Andrea?
Because I was just thinking how it's divided between governments and investors, and actually it's upon governments to decide what kind of investments they want. And with the climate crisis, with the labor crisis, a brain drainage that we were mentioning, there is no future if investments are not sustainable, in the sense that they are behaving in accordance with ESG standards, but also that they're here to stay. Yeah. And mostly big investors are also responsible investors, the one who can offer more. And it is, at the end, the decision of the region who it wants to attract. Because we have also, I mean, people here are ready for much more complex investments than we have now. I mean, labor force is obviously educated enough and capable enough that it can work throughout the world. So it can as well stay here. So I think it's just a bit of a long-term perspective that is needed. And I think, I don't know if you would agree that there are a glimpse of it in the region in the last in the last few years, and understanding, because we had a huge influx of investors that left after 2 or 3 years after, for example, subventions from governments were done. So we had that experience, so it might be a time to change that.
I think there's a couple of points really. I mean, the legislation, we tend to think first and foremost about how it requires proactive actions by businesses to undertake their due diligence, but it also often establishes requirements for complaints mechanisms of various forms. So that's complaints that we can make to a public body about how we've been treated by a business, or whether it's requiring the business to establish its own grievance mechanisms or other forms of complaints mechanisms. So there's also ways by which, you know, kind of human rights issues can be raised up, and in some cases there's penalties if they're not properly addressed. So I think that's worth bearing in mind in terms of as we think about change and what is making things, you know, sustainable or not, and how that affects behaviours of investors and businesses. So I feel that, you know, that's also a kind of positive trend to be watching with some care.
So I wanted to just give one concrete example. So when Europe was looking at passing this legislation, the International Trade Commission in 2022 did a really interesting document where they were saying, listen, if we put requirements on our large European companies that looks to their supply chain, value chain, but let's just make it simple and talk about supply chain so we all know, right? So we look at their business partners and they're gonna have to be requiring higher standards. We're gonna put those suppliers, those smaller and medium-sized enterprises and maybe micro enterprises outside of Europe, we're gonna put them into trouble. And so what we need to do is a lot of accompanying measures, and that's what you were mentioning. So right now, there is an opportunity for the Adria, for where the companies are involved, right? For a lot of technical assistance and funding and knowledge exchange to create what we call in this kind of world, the enabling environment, so that the suppliers can either remain in the European supply chain, they can keep that European market. And I think that's a real opportunity for the region to reach out and say, we want to be preferred suppliers, we want to be in those supply chains and the business partners of the largest multinationals, and there's some know-how that we need, and we need to raise our standards. Let's reach into those pots of money and those channels of knowledge exchange so that we can take advantage of that. And I think that's an opportunity right now.
Yeah, it's an opportunity which is even more significant now with this. So I don't know if some of you are familiar with it, this new offer coming from the European Union of the Reform and Growth Plan, which has, one of its pillars is precisely that of opening the single market sectorially to the countries of the Western Balkans, with a proviso that they should also, in parallel, integrate their markets regionally. But this offer obviously makes this kind of upgrade of companies here in the region even more important, so that they can comply with the EU standards, because obviously the offer is there, but they will have to comply with standards currently applying within the European Union. So that's clearly a challenge for them, but also an opportunity. If I can, looking at the time, because I think we need to wind up, I just wanted to briefly look also at the perspective of the victims or the rights holders, let's say. We haven't talked much about mechanisms for upholding their rights and for submitting their grievances. How do you see that, for example, Dunja, did you see there a role for international organizations in this respect to increase the pressure, increase the accountability of business in this respect?
I think it's particularly important to look at the issue of the lack of transparency and also human rights capacities, I would say, of the key actors in this agenda. And in my view, that can really significantly impact right holders that are seeking, or even limiting their ability to complain, to have the possibility to address these issues. How this can be introduced, it is question for the international organizations, for decision makers when it comes to the region. You just mentioned this one example, but looking at the different sort of ways that the governments in the region are looking at these issues is also bringing much more uncertainty when it comes to the way this should be addressed. So if I look into well-established mechanisms and tools that different international organizations have, like the Council of Europe, like the UN, I do not think that the governments or the EU, that the governments in the region are using those mechanisms in order to address these issues. I mean, we have also at the UN special procedures and their recommendations, which I think are crucial in this field. Then again, we see that those recommendations are not legally binding. And from that moment, the governments here or anywhere else are quite sort of comfortable in not even looking at these issues. How this can be improved and put as a sort of way forward for the region on the way to the EU, I think should be one of the most important issues or questions. So I think the push should come from all sides in order to use the opportunity. And there are so many things that we discussed in the last 2 days that are very much related to this positive push, and what was Federica talking and many other speakers, that the opportunity is now, the time is now. Are we going to use this time for businesses, for human rights, or anything else that we were discussing is a big question, but the potential is there. This summit is giving a platform and also in a way advising the governments and the region to engage even more. So maybe next year would be a very good time to see where do we stand when it comes to this, but also many other topics that were touched upon here. The responsibility is also great. The potential is amazing. I just had a meeting with young people from the Western Balkan, supported by the bank from Montenegro, recognizing that the youth is our future. But if we do not manage to win their hearts and minds in a way by showing that even businesses can comply with human rights and offer better future, then we are entering a not very sort of comfortable time for the future of this region, but also Europe in general.
Can I just give one example? I'm not going to answer the question, but I want to give one example of how powerful a very unknown mechanism is. And the reason that I want to give that example is that I want to emphasize the importance of civil society. The civil society in this region needs to be bolstered. And if they know how to use the tools, even non-binding ones, they can do things. So I advise a large infrastructure company from France. They were investigating, working on it's public, so I can tell you, a hotel in Indonesia. They were going to build a resort area in Indonesia. They weren't there. They had no workers there. They didn't even have the contract signed. They literally just had an MOU, but it came out publicly. They got a letter, their CEO got a letter from 9 special rapporteurs from the UN Human Rights Council. These are unpaid experts. It was an NGO who contacted the special rapporteurs. They wrote a letter to the CEO. The next thing you know, the company is in a panic, and they do human rights due diligence. They start their human rights impact assessment because they were asked to in a letter from the UN. It costs no money, right? It was the civil society calling them up. They decide to write a letter. CEO freaks out. The development team says, oh my God, we've got to do human rights impact assessment. They did it, and they learned a whole lot about the value of impact assessment. And what that business development team, who had never articulated the words human rights, they, in their next project, they proactively did human rights due diligence, called in human rights experts to do the assessment because they understood the actual value that it can bring to the business. And the reason I mention that is because that is it's not even a mechanism for remedy, but it actually can have that impact, right? If you've got civil society and you've got people who can pull the right strings.
It had a preventive effect. The reputational factor is important. Look.
So I would just like to say to the businesses that are in the room, still remaining in the room, you can either wait for your CEO to get a letter from the UN Special Rapporteurs or the UN Secretary General or whoever, or you can come to the workshop that Nevena and my colleagues Hema and Annika are running tomorrow morning, I think in the next building, and learn about how to put in place a due diligence process and an operational level grievance mechanism. So it's up to you. You can take the whichever you wish to take, but we'll be here tomorrow morning and we'll be running a nice workshop on it.
Nevena, the last word, and hope the audience appreciates the fact that Nevena, Dunja, and I are wearing the blue of the European Union. It was perfectly coordinated. Nevena.
I think we need to find a way that market and governments reward progress, because I think we are at that stage now. So we need to approach this without naming and shaming. I just read that in the last week, the first complaint according to German due diligence law came from one of the countries in the region. And that is a good sign. And it's a good sign for that company as well. And good sign for progress for a whole process. So I think that is, as Andrea said, making that coalitions between governments, businesses, and civil society. That's where we need to start at the moment. So.
Thank you. And with these wide words, I think we'll close this panel. Thank you very much for participating, for contributing with your ideas.